This is the last elephant story. There was a wealthy king in Benares, India, and he had a wonderful castle and horses with stables and gardens and all kinds of possessions. But his most loved possession was his elephant, Mahagiri. She had small, bright, intelligent eyes, and she was the color of gray clouds. And she had her own house. And the king took good care of her. And he had a keeper for Mahagiri, Rajendra. And Rajendra loved Mahagiri as much as the king, because every morning he'd get up and he'd take her to the river where she bathed, and he'd collect grass and go to the market and get her the freshest fruit for breakfast. And throughout the day, he'd talk to her and feed her. And at night, he'd play his flute to put her to sleep. So everything was well. And one morning, Rajendra came in and opened the door to the house and went into the stall, getting ready to take her out to the river. And she picked him up and threw him out the house. And she was stomping and trumpeting, and Rajendra was lying on the ground with a broken arm, and they had to get the guards in to tie her up and chain her feet. Nobody knew what was wrong. And the king was very upset, so after getting a doctor to take care of Rajendra, he called his chief minister to go and check on Mahagiri and see what was wrong with her. So he went out and looked into her eyes, and they were clear, but had some fear in them. And he felt behind her ears, and she didn't have a fever. And he listened to her heart, and it was beating a little fast, but nothing irregular. And he looked all over her body for scars or cuts or something causing her pain. And he couldn't find anything. And then just as he was heading out, he saw in the corner near the next stall, the wall of the next stall, but on the ground, a curved knife, like what was used by thieves. So he thought, I wonder if there's a connection. That night, when everyone else was asleep, the chief minister went back to the elephant house and quietly opened the door and entered very quietly. And he could see and hear next to the stall of Mahagiri a group of men talking. Okay, we're going to go and get in and open up the palace and get that chest tonight. But what about the guards? Are you ready to be a real thief and kill somebody? Slowly, the chief minister left the house, bolted it locked, and ran and told the king that there were robbers in the stall next to the elephant, and that was probably the cause of her getting angry and being upset. So the king got the guards and they arrested the robbers. But then he said, what are we going to do to cure Mahagiri? And the minister said, well, since listening to men plot harm and hurtful things upset her, maybe if she's able to listen to people being kind and gentle and good to each other, she'll get better. Excellent idea, said the king. So the minister went out and announced to everyone in the neighborhood and people he knew that he needed a group of people to spend their days in the stall next to Mahagiri, doing their conversation, friendly conversation, and things they usually did to make her feel better. And so every day a different group of people would go there and they'd chat and have fun and bring their children and bring food. And people could see her calming down each day as she saw people being kind and gentle and saying good words to each other. Finally, the chief minister said, I think it's time to release her. Now the king had everybody come out of the elephant house except for courageous Rajinder, who went in, and he first untied the ropes from her ears and her trunk, and then he untied the chains on her big feet, and everybody outside was quiet and wondering if she would be wild again. They held their breath. But Mahagiri looked around and shuffled her feet, and then very gently she took her trunk and wrapped it gently around Rajinder and lifted him up and gently placed him on her back. And then he guided her out the house, and the king and the people cheered and were happy to see Mahagiri being gentle and good as she usually was. And the king said, let's have a picnic to celebrate, and Mahagiri will go with us. And they went down to the river, and Mahagiri bathed in the river, and the children rowed her back. And everybody was happy. And they said Mahagiri seemed even more gentle than she had been before. But Rajinder always remembered. And so he was always especially nice and friendly to make sure she had a good example and didn't get angry again.
This is a story called The Wishing of Biddy Malone. To be sure, Biddy, even as a wee little girl, loved to sing and dance. Unfortunately, her voice sounded like a creaky gate in a wild west wind. And whenever she tried to dance, her great dundering feet tripped all over each other, which was not too good because Biddy Malone always wanted to do her very best. So whenever she made a mistake, she'd kick the ground and scream and make a fuss. And her brothers would tease her. Shuffle and moan, creak and groan, singing and dancing of Biddy Malone. Well, one fine afternoon, Biddy got so angry, she threw a bucket of milk across the room, and she tore down the street and through the town and out by the river. Sometimes that calmed her down. She had a temper that was fine and fierce, and by the time she got down to the river, it was starting to be the soft time of night, right between day and night, when the shadows can play tricks on you. She looked down by the river, and she knew that what she was seeing was a strangeness, and it was not a trick. There, below the willows, were lights, and the most beautiful music she had ever heard. She knew right then that it was the fairies. And all the children had been told by their parents, never, never go near the fairies. They'll trick you. But Biddy Malone could hear that beautiful music, and she couldn't resist. Now Biddy was mortal high, and the little village was very small. But as she walked toward that music, by the time she got there, she was just the right size to go into that little door. And inside, she saw a beautiful group of fairies of all colors and all sizes and all beautifully dressed and dancing. But as soon as they saw Biddy Malone come in the door, the music stopped and the dancing stopped, and all the fairies backed toward the walls. Biddy looked around, and across the room she saw the most beautiful boy she had ever seen. His skin was like an acorn, and his hair as soft as midnight. He was a loveling, and in his hair he had a crown of meadow flowers, and he had a cape of feathers. He walked towards her, and she walked towards him. He said, "Hello, Biddy Malone. It's so nice to see you. Have you come for your 3 wishes?" She didn't know what to say. She said, three wishes? He said, "Welcome, Biddy Malone. Do you have 3 wishes? Can you name them?" "I didn't come for wishes," said Biddy, "but now that you mention it, I do have 2 great yearnings. I would love to sing as beautifully as a bird and dance as light as a deer." She looked into his eyes, and they seemed to go on forever. "These will happen for you, Biddy," he said. "But wishes always come in 3s. Do you have a 3rd wish you can name, Biddy Malone?" She looked down, and she decided to tell him. She said, "I do have a fine, fierce temper, and I do always want to do well, and I do always want to do my best. And when I don't, I get very angry. I would like to have a great, loving heart." He looked at her and smiled and said, "That too will be yours. Shall we dance?" And the music started up, and Biddy found she could dance as light as a deer, and all the fairies were singing as she danced with the loveling, and she could hear her voice coming back to her as she sang too, like a silver thread. She could have danced all night. She could have danced forever, but suddenly it all stopped. The music stopped, and the lovely boy said to her, "It's time for you to go, Biddy Malone." "But I've only just gotten here," she said. "It's time for you to go," he said. She went towards the door, and when she turned back, it was all gone. The lovely boy, the door, the village. Well, she knew that's how fairies worked, and she walked on home, thinking of that loveling. And when she got there, she was surprised to see, in the light of the porch light, there was a black bow on the door, just like people put on their doors when they were in mourning. She ran up the stairs and ran into her house, and her whole family was sitting around the table. When she entered, her brothers looked up and their eyes got big as saucers. Her mother screamed and fell back in her chair. And her father said, "Where have you been? We thought you were dead." "Dead?" she said. "I've only been gone a half an hour." "No, 2 months, they said. 2 months you've been gone. We had your wake and all," said the brothers. "I was only gone a half an hour," she said. Her mother reached out and took her father's hand and said, "She's been with the little people." A few days later, Biddy Malone told her mother about being with the little people, but she was not telling about the beautiful boy, and she was not telling about the 3 wishes. And come to think of it, those wishes were not worth much. Whenever she tried to sing, she still sounded like a rusty gate. And whenever she tried to dance, her feet were like bricks. But there was a music inside her that hadn't been there before, and it made her voice and her feet have a kind of a knowing. And every time she made a mistake, when she started to get angry, she'd think, "Do not get angry with yourself. Have a loving heart." And she'd calm down and she'd work out the problem. And every time she did that, when she closed her eyes, she'd see the loveling, and she'd start hearing the music. So her mother said, "She's been with the fairies." But as she watched her daughter over the next few weeks, she realized she'd never seen her happier. She'd never seen her more kind. And so she stopped worrying about what had happened to Biddy, and she was happy for her. Well, Biddy was a grown woman, But she had worked every day, hours and hours of dancing and hours of singing. And she became the most beautiful singer, the most beautiful dancer in all of the country. And young men from all over came and heard her sing and watched her dance and wanted to court her. But the one thing that Biddy Malone found was that though she had grown a great loving heart, she had no desire to be courted by any of the men that came, for her heart was filled with the loveling. She went down by the river many times, but she never found the village again. And she started realizing, I don't like to be this lonely. I don't like to be this sad, for she had a great sadness in her, as deep as a well. She's told her family, if the next good man that asks me to marry him, I will say yes. The next day, the young school teacher came with a bouquet of flowers and a speckled trout wrapped in brown paper under his arm. And he said, Biddy Malone, will you marry me? Say yes, said her mother. Say yes, said her father. Say yes, say yes, say yes, said her brothers. Biddy tried to say yes, but she couldn't open her mouth. And as she stood there wondering what she was going to say, she heard a very far away music. She raced past the man and down the lane and through the town, and she was not feeling pleasure. No, she was angry. Finally, the last bit of anger had flared up in her, and she raced across down to the river, and she didn't even hesitate until she walked in. She was small. She went through that door, and there was the loveling with a big smile on his face and his hands out to her. She didn't even look at the smile. She said, you lied to me. You fairy trickery. Those wishes, nothing happened. Yes, sure. Yes, the singing, the dancing. I got there, but I only got there through no help of yours, through hard work on my part. And the loveling said, but hush-a thee, hush-a thee. But she would not be hushed. She said, and the third wish, oh yes, I've got a big loving heart, but you tell me, what good does a loving heart do if it can't have what it loves most in the world? You tell me that. Biddy, he said, stop. I didn't say that I was going to grant your wishes. I simply asked you to say them out loud. And I told you they would happen because I knew you had that in you. If I had given you those wishes, your talents and your beautiful dancing, your beautiful voice would mean nothing to you. It means something to you now because it's your own work. And Biddy stopped for a minute and thought about it. And she thought, he's right. I am who I am because I worked for it. And if somebody had given me this, it would have meant nothing. But as for love, said the loveling, you have been in my heart from the beginning of time. I couldn't call you here. I couldn't come back for you until I knew you wanted to be with me as much as I want to be with you. Yestereen, your head told you that it was time to marry. But today, you were unable to marry anyone because your heart loves me too much. And I knew it was time that I could come back for you. I'm yours, Biddy Malone, if you'll take me. Welcome home. Let's dance, she said.